So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ishrit from BITS Goa, and I'm pursuing electrical engineering. And today I'll be presenting my project, which is on the topic the detection and mapping of fish farms and seaweed cultivation zones, specifically in India. So, this is what I'll be covering for the next few minutes. And okay, so addressing the main problem, India is one of the largest aquaculture producing countries in the world. Yet, if you ask where these offshore farms exactly are located, nobody would have a proper answer. And the thing is that this information, this data, all of it exists, but it's scattered across half a dozen agencies like the CMFRI, the MPEDA. All of these, each of these agencies, they have a fragment of this data, but they're not willing to communicate with each other. And that leads to a very big institutional gap in India's blue economy. So, to tackle the problem of detection in India, the most agreed upon method is to use a combination of two different satellites. The first one is Sentinel 1, which uses SAR. So, it basically sends its own signals and it measures whatever comes back to it. So, that is why it can be used in any climate, whether it's monsoon or it's a clear sunny day. And how it works is basically when this signal it strikes the water surface, the it scatters instead of going back to the satellite. That is why the water appears to be dark. And like the water is shown to be dark to the satellite. Whereas when it hits like a rigid surface, like a cage, for example, it bounces right back to the satellite. And that is why these cages are shown to be bright as compared to like the surrounding dark waters. And the second is Sentinel 2, which uses optical imagery and it relies heavily on sunlight, which is why it is useless during the monsoon season. And that is where Sentinel 1 can help us, like during the monsoon season in particular, which lasts for about 4 to 5 months in India. And but an advantage Sentinel 2 has over Sentinel 1 is that it can be used to detect vegetation, like seaweed farms, for example, which is a major focus of my project. Then coming to my contribution, I was told to do three major things. Firstly, I listed out all the different parameters that affect this satellite based detection. For example, you have wind speed, you have wave height, tide level, etc. And then explain how each of these factors they influence the detection in both Sentinel 1 as well as Sentinel 2. And then using the Copernicus browser, I located two areas of interest. The first is a well-known fish farm site off the coast of Chipikulam, and the second is a seaweed farm site off the coast of Mandapam. And then finally, I monitored how these different parameters how they change over a span of 1 month in these two particular areas. So it is mostly just theoretical stuff. Then, so coming to what affects SAR detection in particular, so firstly, the wind speed and the wave height, both of them go hand in hand, and they both basically they roughen the sea surfaces, and then this causes trouble in locating like the floating cages. And then tide level matters as it shows us how much the cage is actually above the water. So usually a lower tide level is better for results because more of the cage is exposed to like the signals. Then the angle at which the beam hits the cage also matters. So generally a steeper angle gives off a better return to the satellite. So the cages appear more brighter to the satellite. Then finally there's polarization where we use both VV as well as VH. And VV takes care of the more smoother surfaces, whereas VH takes care of like the rougher and the messier surfaces. Then optical detection has its own list of five. So the first and the most important one is cloud cover. Uh, a higher cloud coverage makes it tougher for optical detection because of the lesser sunlight. Then there's sun glint, which is the reflection of the sunlight off water surfaces. And it basically makes the water look bright instead of cages. Like the cages are also bright as well as the water. And this makes the water indistinguishable from the cages that are around it. Then there's turbidity. So often at times these suspended particles they get confused for stray cages and they get confused for stray farms, and that leads to the creation of like false data. So like something that it is not there is perceived to be there. Then, as I mentioned earlier, tide level it matters because it shows how exposed the farm actually is. And finally, the sun, the angle of the sun, it changes how the shadows and the brightness is throughout the day. So these are the five for optical detection. And yes, this so these are the two sites that I located. The on the left is the seaweed farm site, which is off the coast of Mandapam. And this image is from the Copernicus browser, and it shows like a green patch of it shows a green patch floating in the water that is slightly away from the coast, and that is how you identify a seaweed farm per se. And on the right is uh, the fish farm site, which was off the coast of Chipikulam. And here the image shows a cluster of evenly spaced dots that are in deeper parts of the water. So for seaweed farms, these farms are very close to the shoreline, but these fish cages and all, they're actually far away from the shoreline as compared in comparison. So yeah, that is how you identify like a fish farm as well as a seaweed farm on the Copernicus browser. Then the actual monitoring, it takes place in 5 different steps. So firstly, an area is chosen on the Copernicus browser that is to be monitored, and then an appropriate index is chosen. So it could be either NDVI for optical imagery or it could be backscatter for SAR. And then these index values are taken over they're taken across every available pass over like a full month. And then along with this, the other parameters like the wind, as I mentioned, all of those can be taken from the Copernicus Marine Service browser. And then finally, all of these values have to be compared with each other before coming to a final conclusion. So yeah, this is an image of the Copernicus Marine Service browser. So firstly, an area, we select an area here. And then from the left-hand side menu, you select the appropriate parameter. For example, I've selected wind here. And then the timeline can be adjusted by moving the slider at the bottom. So you can move it to whichever, you can zoom in, you can move it to whichever month or whichever year you want. And then you can take the readings over a span of an entire month. So yeah, that is how you monitor these different parameters for one entire month. And these are like, this is a list of some of the references that I've just attached. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.